So in case you missed it or have doubts about why listening is such a critical and powerful act of love, make sure to check out our first video in this series entitled The Devastation of Isolation. There you can learn more about the foundational knowledge and biblical understanding for why learning to listen more effectively is so crucial to combating the anxiety, depression, and hopelessness we are seeing in our world today. In this video, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what it practically takes to become a more effective and successful listener. Although some may refer to listening itself as a skill, for our purposes, it is more helpful to think of it as an ability, which is made up of many smaller skills. Just like the ability to play basketball is comprised of smaller skills such as shooting, passing, or dribbling, or the ability to play baseball is made up of smaller skills such as throwing, hitting, and fielding, listening also has smaller, or what we will call fundamental skills. These fundamental skills make up the building blocks for effective listening and the deepening and strengthening of relationships. Knowing and practicing these fundamentals will benefit every relationship in your life, from ministering and serving relationships to friendships, dating, marriages, and parenting. Here are the 7 fundamental listening skills we'll be focusing on today. You'll also find them listed and explained in the supplemental training materials. Prompting and probing, including using open-ended questions. Empathy, emotional vocabulary building, universalization and normalization, using tentative language, incarnational or sacrificial relating, also known as one-way relating, and challenging and confronting. Before we move on though, we need to briefly review one very important concept from our previous video. We need to remember that we'll be using a thesaurus rather than a dictionary approach to learning and growing. What that means is that even though you may or may not be familiar with some of the words or clinical language being used, we are going to try and help connect the terms with concepts, principles, and examples we hope you are already familiar with. In the spirit of unity and togetherness, we're going to look for how things are similar or synonymous with one another and congruent with how the Lord calls us to live. If you recall, one of the synonyms we used for love was listening. We had tested to see whether listening as a synonym for love survived the Bible truth test, and when placing it into 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7, we had gotten, listening is patient and kind. Listening does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. Listening does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. Listening does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Listening bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Listening should never end because God doesn't stop listening to us. Accordingly, we'll be sticking to this passage as we explore the fundamental skills which will produce the type of effective listening that is described. But first, I'm going to introduce you to Darius. Now, Darius is just a made-up guy who is going to be having a conversation with one of his friends throughout our time today. And although Darius is just a made-up guy, however, he's struggling with some very real issues. He's a 67-year-old widowed man who lost his wife 5 years ago to breast cancer. He has 2 grown children, a son and a daughter, both who live out of state. He typically only sees them once or twice a year since his wife passed, although he hasn't seen either of them since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Darius has 3 grandchildren through his son who is married, and his daughter is a single working professional who seems like she is constantly traveling for her job. Darius has diabetes and a host of other medical conditions, which have made the COVID pandemic particularly scary and distressing for him. He had been forced to retire when the pandemic hit, and the company he worked for went out of business, and often spending his days at home alone, he feels lonely, isolated, lost, depressed, and hopeless. Having lost both his wife and his career, He believes his life is meaningless and almost daily has been considering suicide. Before he does, though, Darius calls up a friend and says,
"Hey, it's been a long time. How are you?"
I'm doing well, really well. It's good to hear from you. How have you been holding up?
Yeah, I'm doing well too.
Enter in our very first skill to know when growing as an effective listener: prompting and probing. One thing about listening is that some people need a little bit of help giving us something to listen to. Prompts and probes are verbal and sometimes nonverbal tactics for helping people speak more freely about what's really going on with them. The most common types of prompts and probes are open-ended questions, which are questions that begin using either what or how in order to invite a more in-depth answer. As you will see in the supplemental training materials, prompts and probes can also be single words, statements, keywords, or requests, which promote additional elaboration. Given Darius's somewhat shaky answer, the friend decides to probe a bit.
That was almost believable, Darius. What's really going on? How are you really doing?
Well, you weren't fooled for a second, huh? I'm gonna just be real with you since I know you'd eventually get it out of me anyways.
Uh-huh.
To be honest, I don't even feel like getting out of bed anymore on most days. I wake up and just lie in bed and wonder, what's the point? It's like there's this super heavy cloud hanging over me that just makes everything harder, like I'm trying to move through Jell-O or something. Even when I do get myself up and going, it's like, for what? I just sit in my apartment alone all day. It just feels so empty. Ever since she's been gone, I don't know. Never mind, I never should have said anything. I'm sorry. Can we just talk some other time?
Here we have a great opportunity to dive deeper into our next skill, empathy, and also to begin understanding why, above all else, listening is patient. Using empathy epitomizes patience because it involves appropriately tuning in, listening, and responding to others by sharing a non-judgmental understanding of what they are feeling, thinking, or experiencing. Rather than being an interpretation, empathy conveys a desire to understand how people see themselves, how they see others, and how they see the world from their own personal point of view. Basically, using empathy conveys a willingness to walk in someone else's footsteps, so to speak. It doesn't try to lead or direct them anywhere, but instead shows you are willing to meet someone right where they are at, no matter how difficult or painful their situation might be. Of all the skills we will discuss today, I can safely say empathy is the most important and most powerful. Why? Because God choosing to send Jesus to walk this earth was an act of empathy. The ultimate manner in which God responded to the sin in our world was fundamentally empathic. Jesus met us where we were at and walked in our footsteps. In every way, he was tempted as we are and served as a high priest who was able to sympathize with our weaknesses, our brokenness, and our pain. 1 John 4:19 says, "We love because he first loved us." And similarly, we empathize because he first empathized with us. We learn to walk in the footsteps of others because he first walked in our footsteps. Dr. Bruce Perry goes so far as to say, empathy underlies virtually everything that makes society work, like trust, altruism, collaboration, love, charity. Failure to empathize is a key part of most social problems: crime, violence, war, racism, child abuse, and inequity, just to name a few. And yet, as powerful and effective as empathy can be, there's a basic formula everyone can learn to use. The formula goes like this: you feel, and then you insert the perceived emotion, because, and then you insert the appropriate experiences, thoughts, or behaviors that give rise to the feeling. Going back to our conversation with Darius, using empathy at this point might look something like this.
No, Darius, there's no need to be sorry. I'm glad you called. It seems like you're feeling pretty depressed because of how life's going for you right now.
Maybe, but I don't know if depressed is the word for it. It seems like it's something more than that, or different. I'm just not sure what it is.
Which brings to light another important aspect of empathy, in that you don't always have to be right. Even when you might offer up an emotion or an experience that doesn't quite hit home, simply by trying, you give the person who is sharing the opportunity to better make sense of their own experience. In Darius's case, although many might say depressed seemed to fit quite well, for him it didn't. Which brings us to our third skill, emotional vocabulary building, and why listening must be kind. Although the friend is trying to connect and meet Darius where he's at, Darius himself doesn't seem to be too sure about what's going on, something which is quite common for people experiencing high levels of distress. Thankfully, our friend in this situation is willing to be kind. She remembers that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. She is willing to labor as a listener and not give up on caring for Darius well, because she has put in the work to learn a wide vocabulary of emotions. She can actually help shepherd and guide Darius towards clearer understanding and connection. Have you ever felt that feeling of relief and even exuberation when someone offers up the perfect word or phrase for how you've been feeling or what you've been going through? When they say it and you just want to say, yes, yes, that's what it is. Well, this is the kindness you offer to others when you take the time to build your emotional vocabulary. If you remember the proverb that death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits, then remember that having an apt word for someone can be truly life-giving, both for others and ourselves. So with compassion for the struggles Darius is facing, the friend tries again.
So depressed doesn't quite fit, huh? Maybe downhearted, or dejected, or maybe even devastated fits better.
Wow, the thought never really crossed my mind until you said it. But I really think I do feel devastated. I mean, losing my wife 5 years ago was crushing. But when the pandemic hit and I lost my job, and now just sitting here not knowing what to do and afraid to go out because of all my health stuff, I think that's exactly what I am. I'm devastated.
Which invites for us an opportunity to introduce our next fundamental skill, universalization and normalization, along with the biblical admonition that listening does not envy or boast. Put simply, to neither envy nor boast means to neither look down upon or gaze up at others from a place of either judgment or covetousness, respectively. Romans 3:23 tells us all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And 2 Corinthians 10 says, when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding. Basically, we're all in the same boat. Although each of us has a uniqueness in our own right, there is a universal aspect to our experiences in this world, and in particular to our struggles and pain, that works to normalize experiences which can initially feel just overwhelming and crushing. Jesus expresses the sentiment of universalization and normalization when he forewarns his disciples that in this world you will have tribulation, but take heart. And Peter does the same thing in his letter when he exhorts his readers to know that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. I cannot tell you how many times people come to see me in my counseling practice and exclaim with a huge sigh of relief and just a look that matches after I have offered some universalization and normalization. They exclaim, "I thought I was the only one." In Darius's case, universalization and normalization might look something like this.
Being devastated totally makes sense given what you've been through and what you're still facing. It's actually hard for me to imagine someone feeling much differently. I can see any one of those things being devastating by themselves. Your wife, your job, your health, the pandemic. But having all of them is like a whole other level.
That's really helpful to hear. Honestly, I was really beginning to wonder whether I was just going crazy or there was just something super wrong with me.
Moving through our passage, our next description of love and listening is that listening is not arrogant or rude. With much of that seeming self-evident, I will simply share 3 practical tips that, even when not intended, can come off as arrogant and rude. The first is to avoid addressing difficult situations using the phrase, "at least." Saying things like, "at least you got a good retirement deal," or "at least you had 40 years with her," can come off as invalidating or dismissive of the pain the person is going through. There is a time and a place to look for silver linings within someone's experiences, but those are best left for when they start to share them. The second is to try to avoid asking too many questions. A lot of times, even when we are asking sincerely and out of a place of care, we can end up trying to get all the details of someone's story to the detriment of the essence of what they are trying to share. It's good to show interest and definitely okay to ask questions. Just be mindful that too many questions can be frustrating for someone to try to answer or can come off like an interrogation. The third practical tip actually leads us right into our next fundamental listening skill, that of using tentative language and the understanding that listening does not insist on its own way. The tip is avoid giving advice unless asked for or granted permission. We often offer advice because we think one way is the right way to do something. And the reality is we might even be right. However, the importance of using tentative language and seeking permission is to make sure the person you are speaking with is in a position to hear you and to receive what you have to offer. Using phrases like, "Would it be okay if I spoke into that?" or "Can I share some input about that?" are great ways to seek such permission. And phrases like, "It sounds like," "It seems," "maybe," and "if I'm hearing you right," are all very helpful verbiage to make a regular part of your vocabulary. You'd be surprised by how much more receptive people are to hearing and receiving your counsel when you add these simple yet powerful language adjustments. It is far more effective to offer your own way using tentative language than to try and insist on it and only be met with defensiveness. So let's check back in with Darius and see how his friend does it.
Darius, do you mind if I share something with you?
Sure, go ahead.
I feel like I have a lot of questions for you and a lot of things to say, but I'm also pretty concerned about how difficult your situation is and what you shared with me about the struggles with simply getting out of bed and how life is seeming so pointless to you right now. Would you be willing to talk with a counselor or someone who has some more experience dealing with stuff like this?
His friend decided that the best way to care for Darius was to try to connect him with a mental health professional. This doesn't mean she has to stop listening or caring for Darius, and I would even say far from it, but she realizes what he is going through warrants a different level of care. Which leads us into our next fundamental listening skill. This is a skill every Christian should possess and be able to employ, but it is also one which highlights one of the major differences between professional mental health relationships and most other relationships in life. In scriptural language, this skill is known as incarnational or sacrificial relating. While in clinical language, it is known as one-way relating. In either vernacular, this skill accentuates how listening is not irritable or resentful. In Paul's letter to the Philippians, he encourages the church to have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Just prior to this, he had exhorted them to, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Incarnational relating happens when we lay down our personal and individual rights for the sake of the other. In this case, the person we're listening to. We set aside our desire to share our own stories, to satisfy our curiosities, to offer advice, and in many ways we lay down our right to be who we are, just as God did in Jesus. We set aside the expectation of fairness and mutuality within the relationship, and we devote ourselves entirely to the service of helping the other person to a better place. The reason this type of relating is not irritable or resentful is because we do this freely and willingly. We choose to empty ourselves. We acknowledge up front that this is a service being provided to the one at the sacrificial cost of the other. This one-way nature of relating is a major part of what helps make counseling so successful, as both client and counselor agree from the outset that they are both there to serve the client's needs. Darius, however, still has his doubts.
I don't know about that. A counselor? Really? I mean, it's really not that bad. I'm fine. I was just talking. I don't need all that.
I've heard you talking, Darius. I really have. I've heard how hard life is for you right now, and I've heard how alone and helpless you're feeling because you told me. Devastated doesn't quite mix well with either not that bad or fine. And like I said, what you're facing is legit. It's tough. I just don't want you to face these things alone, and I don't want you to give up on life.
Enter in our final skill, challenging and confronting, and why listening is loving, but it certainly does not rejoice at wrongdoing. Challenging and confronting while listening is not about picking fights or starting arguments. It's all about pointing out inconsistencies within what you are hearing. The friend in our conversation utilized this skill wisely when she stated, "Devastated doesn't mix well with not that bad or fine." Truth, above all else, is known by consistency, and Darius consistently communicated a need for help with this situation and getting unstuck from the devastation he is suffering. At the same time, challenging and confronting is a great skill to use for pointing out positive inconsistencies too, or things you've observed that the person said or did, but that don't seem to be the things they are focusing on. In this sense, challenging and confronting also highlights how listening rejoices with the truth. Here's how the friend pointed out some positive truths in what Darius was sharing.
Plus, I'm not sure you realize that you've already taken the first and the most important step. You reached out. I have to imagine it wasn't easy sharing what you did with me today, was it?
You don't know the half of it. I must have picked up the phone a dozen times to call you before I actually did. And I almost didn't do it again today. I don't know. I guess something inside me just told me it was the right thing to do.
I think that something inside of you is strength. And like it or not, I don't think you give yourself enough credit for the strength you have. I know it feels like you've been knocked down and spun around, but even just sharing with me what you did today shows there's some fight left in you. I just think a counselor might be able to help you find some more strength and fight.
Yeah, you're right. I don't like it. But I also think you're right reaching out for some more help. I guess I can at least give it a shot. Sitting at devastated, there's probably only one way to go. You have any recommendations for who I can call?
Our passage closes with the proclamation that listening bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. When people find out that I work as a mental health counselor, I often get asked the question, how do you sit and listen to all that pain and suffering day after day? Doesn't that just kill you? And the first thing that comes to my mind is the passage in Hebrews 12 and how it describes Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Doing the work of listening and connecting with people in pain does have its times when it feels like a cross, when things are heavy and hope seems all but lost. But this verse always reminds me that it's worth it. It reminds me that the cross doesn't end in the pain or the shame. It ends with the joy. I just have one last story I want to share before we end our time here for today. It's about a client I had many years ago who had all but given up. He got hooked on drugs, lost his marriage, was homeless, and had decided to kill himself. He went to the liquor store to get up the courage and for one last celebration before he committed suicide. Walking out of the store, he saw a little black dot on the ground with just a tiny little speck of sparkle that happened to catch his eye when it caught the light. He bent over to get a closer look and reached down to pick the item up. And as he looked closer and turned it over in his hand, he realized that under all the dirt and grime, amidst the various scratches and dents, what he was holding was a nickel. Right then and there, he broke down sobbing as he realized the nickel he was holding still had the same value as any shiny and polished nickel being minted today. All the filth and brokenness which had accumulated on top of it did nothing to change the fact that what he was holding still had worth. That moment and that thought gave him enough hope to call our counseling center and come in for help. After he graduated from counseling, I only heard from him once. He called into the center to let us know he was doing well. He had gone back to school, got certified as a drug and alcohol counselor, and was helping others the way he believed he had been helped. And he thanked me, above all things, for listening to him, for sitting with him during that time, and for having patience with him as he took the time he needed to clean off the muck. Which brings me to our final lesson on listening and the moral of this story. Always remember that no matter what muck someone might come to you to share about, there's a nickel under there somewhere. And godly listening can help it shine again. God bless and thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.